Hello, everyone. Hi, Mariusz. How are you?
Hi, Enrico. Very good. Thank you very much.
Good stuff. So, thanks, Mariusz, for being with us, and welcome all. I already see loads of people. We didn't realize when we invited Mariusz, he's a superstar, YouTube influencer in the Polish world. So, even more than happy to have you here with us, Mariusz. We've had the pleasure to meet. I think was it for the first time at our retreat in Riccione in 2022, and I know you did a video with Alberto after that, and there was a nice all orange setting of. We did the orange t-shirts for that event, so if you are into event storming, and if you are here, probably you are, you will see the pan there. Yeah. So today we have the first remote meetup of the year. Very happy to have Mariusz with us to talk about, well, you see it already, no surprise, aggregates. So we are very deep in the DDD world. Just a few more things for me. You are more than welcome during the conversation to drop your questions on the YouTube chat. We're gonna stop every now and then to answer them, so feel free to ask around. And Mariusz, I would say over to you.
Thank you very much, Enrico, for a really nice introduction. I appreciate. And it's always good to see all of you.
So many.
Okay,
Wow.
okay,
Excellent.
so let me switch the screen. Would you, Enrico?
Absolutely. Let's do this. Da-da. Cool.
Okay, so as Enrico mentioned, my name is Mariusz Gil, and today session will be about designing implements aggregates. So don't expect a very deep dive. We've just I've got 1 hour, but I would like to share my perspective on this very interesting topic. And I said my perspective because there are many different ways how we can design, how we can implement. I would like to share how one of my approaches. So as I mentioned, my name is Mariusz. I live in Wrocław, Poland, which is a beautiful city in western Poland, which is famous from different things, the bridges and the really nice old town. And maybe some of you know my city from an unconventional way how you can transport across the city. On the daily basis, I'm a consultant, I'm a trainer, I'm doing different things with teams, both on legacy stuff and new projects. I'm a host of Better Software Design podcast. Unfortunately, this podcast is mostly in Polish, so I'm really sorry if you are not familiar with this language. However, there are more English-related content on the way, so please stay tuned. So agenda for the next hour, more or less, looks like that. We perform a small introduction to the topic. Then there will be a short event storming session on 2 levels, the big picture and the process level. During the session, I'm going to discuss different techniques, different heuristic you can apply during the modeling. And after all, we may fly by short code, which can be one of possible way how you can implement the knowledge you extracted from the event storming session. And after all, I've got hope that there will be a time for some Q&A session. So the topic of this workshop, the topic of the session demands to answer one question. So what is an aggregate? Couple back years ago, I think it was 2019 at Kandinsky conference in Berlin, there was a session related directly to this question. It wasn't a conference track talk. It was, I believe, one of the community submission to the open space part of this conference, where different people with really nice knowledge about the domain-driven design and ideas was trying to answer this question and explaining this concept using a single sentence. So I was looking for the photos from this workshop, from this session, and then find on Kenny Schwegler and rather Maziarka Twitter's pages some photos. And as you see, there are a bunch of possible short explanation what the aggregate is all about. So I'm not going to make through every single sticky because there are many of them, but two of them always make me think about it, and there's some consequences of that. First of those stickies is that the aggregate is the thing you will never do right. And I need to agree because designing an aggregate can be very, very difficult. No matter how many knowledge you've got today in your project, probably tomorrow will be a little bit the situation on the world, on your project, on your domain will be a little bit different. So you need to adapt, and your design must be a little bit modified. However, it's also, even if you got all the knowledge about the problem you are modeling, it may be not enough to design it perfectly. Based on the handwriting, I believe the author of the sticky is Alberto. So Alberto, I'm going to agree with you that designing an aggregate is things that sometimes it's very, very difficult to do right. And the second sticky I would like to refer is this one. I don't know who is the author because it's very, very difficult to see this mention. If you know, please let me know. But the explanation is that an aggregate is something you don't really need. And I need to disagree because these aggregate concepts can be very, very helpful in some specific scenario. So if this mention, if this explanation will be not always needed, okay, I can agree, but not needed, completely disagree, because there are some scenarios where this concept can be very, very helpful for the team if you've got the problem which can be addressed using this pattern. However, there is a free spot on this board, and if I could add my sticky with my own explanation, very short, one sentence long, what is an aggregate, based on my observations, how different people are learning domain-driven design and enter to this word, I would like to say that the aggregate is a unit of sometimes bad fascination. Let me explain what I mean by that. Because if you are a software developer and you know nothing about the domain-driven design, but you would like to try, the aggregates, aggregate itself is probably very, very first pattern you would like to see. Because it is mentioned on multiple blogs, on multiple conferences, probably almost everywhere when the domain-driven design topic is mentioned, the aggregate is in the core. And if you stop here, because you saw it, you can implement it, and you stop here, this fascination is bad, because there are more important things than the aggregate itself. And the reason why it's bad is that if you omit the second part, which is more important, and you would like to see aggregates in your system, no matter what your system is doing, you will probably see them. If there is no aggregate at all, if they are not needed in your system, and this is a problem. Because after all, you will end up with maintaining the code base, which can be very difficult to understand by other person in your team which are not familiar with this concept. And maybe your code will be a little bit more over-engineered because this pattern is not needed, and the benefits are not useful in your project. However, starting learning domain-driven design from these concepts, even from the code, it's from my perspective, it's an opener to way more important part. I mean the strategic part, because if you saw an aggregate, you probably will start asking some questions. And after all, maybe tomorrow, maybe next day, maybe next month or whatever, you will start to understand that there is something more. And there are those concepts like bounded concept, like subdomains will start to emerge. And after all, probably you will realize that those concepts are heavily important, and aggregates are just supporting all those strategic parts. So what is an aggregate? Because I'm using this word without not providing you any explanation what this aggregate concept means. But at this point, it's a horrible wrong question, because an aggregate is an answer, tactical answer for the problem, and we didn't discuss the problem yet. So why we should even care about this aggregate concept? And to to highlight why this concept and what kind of scenarios are enough to introduce those ideas to the code base is just an example. So let me show one, of course, simplified example. This example is taken from the real project, but I need to map the domain from the real business to the something we can discuss to not avoid any NDAs problems. So let me switch to the mirror. Okay. Imagine that there is a process when you, as a customer, you are trying to apply for the loan. So you would like to submit a loan application. So this event is very, very important for you because after all, you would like to start a process which probably will end up with some money for you. But to achieve this point in this process, you need to perform many different actions. So you need to start preparing your loan application. You need to provide a lot of information. For example, what is the type of this loan, why you would like to have it, what kind of money you would like to have, and a lot of different information. So from the interface point of view, you will see a large form, and you need to type a lot of information just to provide enough information to someone later in this process, which will be able to review your application and finally decide you get the money or not. And during this process, to prove your, for example, financial situation, you need to provide a lot of different documents. Those documents also will be reviewed, and the decision on top of your application will be derived from the decision making on top of documents you prepared. And you may send an Excel document, for example, with the status of your bank accounts. You may say you may upload and send the PDF files with some checks from other banks or different type of documents. And of course, depending what type of loan you're applying for, this kind of documents must be provided by you. So quite simply process. When you're starting preparation, you are providing the information, you are attaching the documents, and then submission, and that's it. From requester point of view, it's enough. But then when this particular event happen, the next process may be performed, I mean the review. So the reviewer, the person from the organization, is starting to read your application, is starting to reviewing documents you uploaded, and finally this person is going to accept or reject a particular document you uploaded. So for every single document, there are two options. One is that document will be accepted as everything is fine, or another, your document will be rejected because, for example, instead of your photo of your identity card, you send a photo of your cat because of maybe you made a mistake, and you cannot modify your documents in this scenario. Your whole the process will be stopped, rejected, because probably you messed up with the documents. Of course, you may perform another application process. You may upload those documents one more time with all the fixes you probably need to perform. And after all, decision by the decision, this system need calculate final decision about your application. So the reviewer is going to accept or reject some documents, but the system will decide what is the final decision about the application. So every single submission, every single review, there is a calculation. Can we calculate the final score of your application at this point? Sometimes yes, sometimes not. For example, if the application was started with the flow where the reviewer must review all the documents you provided, this final score calculation must be performed at the end. But sometimes, maybe for different types of loans, maybe only half of them must be reviewed, and this is completely enough from the business point of view. And moreover, sometimes, just to a little bit complicate this example, sometimes this reviewer may change his decision for some kind of loans applications, because for some of them the changing decision is allowed, sometimes not. So for example, if you accepted a document, in some scenarios, you can change decision unless the final application score was calculated. So you've got some period of the time, let's say here, when you, under some conditions, you may modify your decision. For example, you can reject document you accepted already. And after all, if you've got as a requester, your application was accepted, then another process of granting this loan you are applied for can be started. But this is a part of different department, and then they will be handle this part of business flow. So there are 2 points where things are a little bit complicated. One is here, where the decision can be modified, and another is here, where calculation from the final score about your loan application can be performed. Because, as I mentioned, sometimes we need to wait for all the decisions. Sometimes it's enough, for example, to have just half of them. And just to, let's make this way. Just to summarize this flow with a few examples. Maybe you've got some documents, decisions, maybe sometimes depending on the policy which will be applied in this particular scenario, you can calculate final score or not, or maybe sometimes depending on the scenario, you may know that your data can be modified before the final score calculation will be performed. And based on this process, you may probably think it's not so complicated. There are 2 parts. We are talking about the documents. We are talking about the applications. What is the problem? Where the complexity lives here? And when we are looking on this process from the perspective of the single instance of this process, or from the perspective of a single actor in this process, probably it is very, very difficult to notice that there are some hidden complexity. But when we add another instance of this process performed exactly the same time, or where we add another actor performing maybe exactly the same operations but in different order, we may introduce some race conditions. And it is a reason and the method how we can challenge ourselves to identify some issues. And if we start to think, okay, so from the analytic point of view, from the perspective of the business, we see the events, but we start to think, okay, how we can implement them into the software, or how they are implemented, because we've got some already implemented software in our repository, we may realize that, okay, there are some gaps from the technical point of view where different things may happen. So, for example, based on the real scenario from this particular process, where this reviewer was trying to perform this operation like accepting or rejecting, the application must verify that, okay, this whole application must be in the status which allows us to perform this operation. Because if we got final score calculated, accepted or rejected, we cannot modify this information, even if this process was configured to do this, but the final score was already done. So from the implementation point of view, sometimes we need to fetch extra information from the database, because if we start from, let's say, a typical naive design, we've got the document with the status and the loan application with the status, because this is a very, very well-known concept, and at the end of the day, half of the world is built on top of statuses, we may end up the situation where even verifying a single check allows us to or require a lot of checks from the database. Because if you are trying to modify a status of the single object in your system, and then based on the calculations on different objects, you need to modify yet another different object, you're probably doing a lot of queries, a lot of modifications. And if during this phase, another process, for example, another reviewer will trying to perform a different operations, let's say here, you may end up with the race condition situation when your application fetch some data just to verify them in the application layer, but before some other changes were introduced into the system and stored into the database, there is a gap sometimes milliseconds, sometimes seconds, depending on the shape of the system and design of the system, where you may introduce inconsistency. An example which was taken from the real-world project was exactly like that. There was a scenario when here, where application was doing a lot of database queries to modify changes and introduce some changes into the different objects into the systems, another process for another reviewer, which was absolutely okay from the perspective of the status of the data in the database, affected finally the final score application. And this process was ended up with this shape. So the process was started with a setup where decision based on the decision for every single document can be modified by different actors, but the final score must be calculated, and the loan application must be accepted where all the documents were accepted. And there was a few milliseconds where there was an inconsistency, and finally the state of the database looks like that. The document was finally accepted, but one of the most important documents were rejected because of this inconsistency. And after all, this problem cost company a few millions euro. So how we can solve this kind of problem? Because the aggregate, the topic of today's session, is designed to solve this kind of problem, where multiple maybe actors, multiple sources of change are trying to modify the state of the system, and we would like to avoid it. So when we would like to expand our knowledge and gather more knowledge, probably we can realize that big picture event storming, sometimes it's not enough. And we would like to add some other elements from event storming notation, for example, like commands. And the crucial part of this flow is, of course, reviewing this process. So let's start by adding some operations. So if I would like to accept document, so in terms of notation, I would like to send my request, accept document. Probably I would like to add some information, which document in which application I would like to accept, or like to send my rejection. And probably if I see some other events, maybe this one is not necessary. When I see this kind of operation that as an actor in this process, I'm sending this command to the system, to the process, I immediately see that I expect that at least some events will be produced, or maybe none of them will be produced if I violate some rules. For example, if the loan application was finally accepted and the score was calculated to accept or reject, maybe even if I've got even possibility to send this command, it should be automatically rejected because we close this part of the process. However, leaving this board into the command event situation is not something we can do better, because we can start to think, what are the other consequences of this particular customer request? So, for example, if I, as a reviewer, I'm trying to accept the comment, I'm sending this intent to the system, and the system allows me to perform, immediately I'm expecting that this other events probably will happen. So if I start to think, is it possible from the business point of view to postpone some of those events? For example, those events. What will happen if I postpone it for 1 minute? What kind of negative business impact I can introduce to my business? I can realize that, okay, so by postponing those events, I create a 1 minute gap when the other events may happen, and we end up with exactly the same situation as before. So probably I will expect that those events will happen immediately after I send this command, and of course some rules will not be violated. But when it comes to granting a loan, which probably will be followed by informing other department that the loan must be granted, let's say instruction issued to other department, the situation is a little bit different, because if we accepted the loan and then issuing this instruction to other department can be postponed, maybe for 1 minute, maybe for 15 minutes, maybe for an hour. Of course, postponing for weeks will introduce some issues, but postponing for even seconds or minutes will not introduce any potential business problematic issues. So here, I see that we can put some boundary, and on the left side on this boundary, we expect that those events will happen probably together in all or nothing mode. But on the right, yeah, there is no need for that, no reason to perform those events immediately. Probably here also there will be some kind of policy, because maybe some other checks should be performed, or maybe this process of instructing other departments is a little bit more complicated. So in this kind of scenario, I see that the number of the events is a little bit bigger, but there is a small difference between them. And here there is a boundary, and this boundary allows me to think that on the left side there is something which is something different on the right side. So let's switch to the presentation. What? Sorry, wrong screen. Yeah. So at this point, we can think about it this way. We discovered the area where we expect that those events, after sending the command, sending the intent to the system, will happen in the mode I would like to call all or nothing. I expect that all of events will happen together, or maybe some of them if there is no need to calculate or no possibility to calculate final score of the loan. However, probably they should happen together. Some events may happen a little bit later, and there is no need to expect that they happen immediately, because there is, as I mentioned, there is no problem from the business point of view if we can postpone it for a moment. So taking a look on this boundary allows me to think that, okay, inside this boundary, I can expect that the required consistency level is very, very strong. It's all or nothing, together or none of them. But the outside of the boundary, this complexity, this consistency is a little bit relaxed. So eventual consistency is not an issue. So I see that there is an area in the system when I can send some intents from the business point of view. I see some actions, I mean some result of those actions described as an events, but I don't know what is inside. And this is a question I need to answer. What should be inside this consistency boundary? I see what kind of communications we've got. I see what kind of intents I'm sending, and I see some results, but I don't know what is inside or what I should put inside. So at this point, I can start from very, very naive approach. Let's say this is the first one. I saw some data like loan application, like documents. So my very, very first approach may be, okay, let's put everything inside. It's a naive situation, of course, a naive approach. However, it works in many, many scenarios. So in speaking of our example, in this boundary, I can put the whole loan application with a lot of different information which are related to that, like submission date, the credit check, the reasons, the amounts, days, everything what was provided by the customer on this first phase of this process. And this application is, of course, related to the documents, and every single document is described by many, many different fields like content, submission days, one more time, status of reviewing, some antivirus checks, etc., etc. But in this approach, I would like to put everything inside. So, as I mentioned, this setup sometimes works, But in some scenarios, we are just opening doors to the new level of problems, because if we create at the beginning the object, I'm referring the object because I'm using mostly object-oriented programming. When we create an object which is huge, which embed a lot of information, the gravity and the mass of this object will attract another information, another use cases, and this object will be bigger, bigger, and bigger. And after all, we've got some black hole class object in the system. Probably if you've got in your system the object, which is, I don't know, 10,000 lines long, probably this is very, very similar situation. And growing the size has also some consequences, because after all, you need to fetch this data from the database. So if this object contains a lot of information and your tool from the you are using is going to fetch all the data every single time when you are interacting with this document, you put a lot of pressure on your database. So every single operation probably will be slower and slower and slower. And if this huge black hole class object is your boundary of consistency in your system when you are trying to be consistent during the change, remember that probably maybe there are a lot of users for this object, maybe from different use cases. So if one person can modify this object, probably other should wait. So your system going to be slower and slower and slower. And of course, if your system, if your object is not so huge, if you are not having so many operations, or you are not supporting many, many different users at the same time, so the concurrency level is very, very low, yeah, maybe this approach may work. As I mentioned, in most scenario, it should work. But if you see this kind of problems related to performance, you may start to apply the second approach. And the second approach demands to answer one more question. As you see, we started from the very, very simple question, what's an aggregate? And right now we've got even more question to answer. And the question related to this big object is, what is the real reason for us, from the business point of view, for having this data? And this is a very, very interesting question, because I believe there are 4 reasons why we should have those data in the system. And knowing the reason for every single piece of information allows us to make a way better decision than without this information. So let's talk about those reasons. The first reason is probably the obvious one. We are having some data, maybe in this black hole class object, because of identity tracking. We need to identify this particular object along many others, because we need to modify this object, not this one, this one. So maybe it's an ID, maybe it's a combination of other parameters, because we are using some composite keys in our application, but this information is needed because of identity tracking. The second one is also obvious, because this consistency boundary is designed to avoid violating a business environment. We've got some business rules to maintain. For example, you cannot introduce, for example, change in your decision about the documents if the whole documents, the whole process was completed. It's you may fight with the consequences of your mistake, but when the final decision was done, you cannot perform it. So there's an environment to protect, and maybe some information is needed, because without this information, you cannot protect this environment. So this is the second reason. The third reason is capturing the changes, because sometimes those informations will be modified. In this example, we are talking about the status, one of possible way how you can model in your system the information about this decision, the statuses. The status field will be changed, because at the beginning probably its decision is none or pending, but if you accept or reject, this information will be stored in this field. At the same time, this field will be used, this information will be used for protecting invariants. So more reasons for particular information, the more confident I've got, okay, I really, really need this information here. And the last one, the missing one, is also probably the obvious one, because if there is no identity tracking reason, protecting the variant reason, or capture changing reason, so why we need to have this information in our system? And this reason is the presentation. Maybe our users would like to see those data in the user interface. For example, when you would like to register your decision to accept or reject this document, you would like to see the document itself. You would like to see the content of this document. You would like to see the bigger picture. You would like to see about something about the customer. So some presentations reasons are coming into the play. Or maybe you are not presenting this information to the customer in the user interface, but you are storing this data and you are sending this data across the network, for example, with API, because the other services later in the process pipeline are going to need this information. So if we've got a situation when the object is huge and the number of information needed to store in the system inside this consistency boundary seems to be huge, and we know exactly what is the scenario, what is the use case for every single piece of information, and we would like to improve the performance of the system, just to make this boundary a little bit smaller, just to put smaller number of data inside this boundary, I would like to make some steaming operation, and I would like to extract some presentation details outside our consistency boundary. This is just a presentation. If this information is going to be changed, it's just a presentation, I can extract it to the, let's say, particular new entity, add some identity tracking information, and correlate this consistency boundary data with some presentation data. And I can interact with those data differently. Because, for example, when it comes to only reading, maybe I would like to read only those presentation data. Maybe I've got some copy of important informations which will be embedded into this consistency part, but the reason is just I'm going to show you those information. If I show something from the system and the data fetched from the database are flying over the network to the interface, in the meantime, they can be still, because the source of the truth, I mean the database itself, was modified. So every single information which was sent to the presentation layer is obsolete by design. And when we're talking about the changes, maybe there's a similar situation. Maybe if we are storing some changes just for the tracking history, but the information we are captured are not related to the protecting invariants. I mean, those data are not needed to maintain the business rules. Maybe we can apply exactly the same approach. Maybe we can extract some data outside this consistency boundary. So after all, this consistency boundary will be a little bit smaller. And then, of course, on the presentation layer, we need to more perform a little bit more queries, because before maybe there was one large query, but now we've got multiple sources of the data. But when it comes to changing the number of the data we need to maintain, and we need to care about the consistent change, will be a little bit smaller. So probably we can introduce a lot of performance gain by reducing the number, the data we are trying to log for the modification. So after all, in the strong consistency boundary, usually in the perfect world, I would like to embed only those information which are heavily connected with those invariants and maybe some tracking. And of course, we can add some other information, even for the presentation, just to be pragmatic, because maybe there is no need to extract one or two informations if they are not so big in the database. Maybe it will be way easier for the team to even to add some presentation or capture changing information without creating some stacks for extracting those data outside this consistency boundary. So speaking in terms of this example, inside this consistency boundary, based on the process we discussed, probably it will be enough to have a status, an ID, maybe some dates. But submissions dates, credits checks, the reasons, amounts, antivirus checks, and other information related to the document or loan application can be extracted to separated entity, correlated, and changes probably will be performed on the data you see on the screen. So, and sometimes it's enough. We solved the consistency problems. We solved some of the performance issue by reducing the number of information you are trying to keep locked in the changing phase. But sometimes it's not enough. Sometimes you would like to apply something more. Even if you perform those steps and still you've got the performance issue, maybe it's worth to think about the life of this object, because designing an object which must guarantee the consistency rule during introducing the change in your system, when this object lives, let's say, 10 milliseconds or 1 second in your system, may be a little bit different than maintaining the situation where this object lives, for example, 2 years in your system. And moreover, it's worth to understand what is the frequency of the change you are trying to introduce in this object. So generally speaking, how does the life cycle of the concept looks like? Because if you've got an object, this consistency boundary designed, and this object contains, for example, a lot of data, but during the 1 year long life cycle emits, let's say, 20 events. So the frequency of the change is very, very low. But you've got another object which contains a lot of more information. Thousands of events per day are introduced. Maybe you will be able to notice that during this life cycle, there are some milestones where every single milestone define a part of the life cycle of this object, and only part of the data are really, really important to maintain those business rules. So, for example, if you are talking about, let's say, hotel reservations, the natural way how you can split even very, very long-lived object during the time is the day manner, because during the night you can convert your object into the new instance of your object without remembering all the history inside the object. You can extract it to the particular another object. And some business problems are heavily designed over the time, like shifts, like days, or something like that. And you may use those information to split your large object into the smaller instances and the bigger number of instances of smaller objects. When one object will become with another, will become another. So, as you see, there are multiple ways, multiple things, multiple approaches how you can think about designing new objects. So I show you just three different ideas, from putting everything inside an object, extracting some information by looking what is the reason why you need to put something into the boundary, or looking on the life cycle of this event, of this object, just to notice that maybe there are some milestones, and you can split this life cycle of huge object into the bigger number of life cycles of smaller objects. So let me switch the editor, because if you are talking about this loan application, and finally we designed that, or decide that we don't need in this application object a lot of information, because they are not needed to maintain these integrity checks, like information how much money you would like to have, and all the informations you really need to maintain those rules are just the statuses. The possible implementations looks exactly as we mentioned, that you've got an object in your system which have a decision about the final score of your calculation. I mean, on the application is accepted or not, and you've got collection of decisions for every single attachment, for every single document the customer uploaded. But the content of this document, this information about the name, about the type, about the content, can be extracted to completely different object, because the reason to have this data is just a presentation. The information about the status is used for maintaining the integrity rule. So after all, if we see that in our process, there is a moment when then actor, reviewer is going to accept or reject this document, all we need to do is to check in very, very consistent way, is it available to perform? Can we do it? If yes, we can perform every single step. I mean, we need to decide, we need to register this decision. Sometimes it will be overwritten or not, and later, finally, we need to calculate this final decision. So the part we discovered that we expect some consistency with the events can be introduced into the code, into the single method, when all the events will be performed immediately together in mode I we call all or nothing. All or nothing if we violate some rules. So there will be a connection between a model we discover with the code. Of course, you don't see any events here in this code because this code is not event based. It's just an example, because the analytic model on the event storming can be expressed by event, but the event describe a significant change in our system, in our process, and from the perspective of the code, changing the status, changing in the state of the object still is the significant change. However, of course, if we would like to have or if you are designing a new system, we can decide to start from with the events from scratch. So, however, there are more elements in this software, because as you see, there are some policies performed here. One for registration your decision, and then this is just a policy which can be performed here if we are not violating the final calculation rule. And sometimes, depending on the scenario, depending on a particular type of this loan, we can decide what kind of registration policy can be. For example, are we allowing for overwriting decision or not? Your decision is just a single decision, and you cannot modify this decision, even if you perform one of them. So let's go back to the slide one more time. Yeah. And here, after all, is just there's one more question to answer, because if we perform few different steps from large object by extracting information, and we end up with the smaller possible amount of data which must be consistent during the change, we can ask ourselves, is this set of information like status, ID, set of collections, decisions about the documents, is it really a loan application? Is this document described as a status ID and maybe some date is a really document? Because probably not, because none of the field, none of the information we see probably should allow us to name it as a document. Probably the way better naming which can be introduced during the analysis is a loan application review or something like that. And then it makes a lot of sense, because if we are talking about the process, it's just we are talking about the reviewing. The loan application is just a set of the data you are trying to push into the process. So yeah, sometimes you can postpone naming, and this is a generally good idea to postpone the naming as much as you can. The same situation as the design and architecture, because the good architecture usually allows you to postpone your decision. So first, let's see how something behaves, what kind of operations, what kind of interactions, even in terms of comments from the event storming, we perform with this boundary of the consistency, what kind of data are really, really needed to maintain this consistency. And then if we know what kind of actions and what kind of information we need, let's then name it. However, there are some different approaches, because we are using at this point some event storming, just some analytics. But maybe if you are opening your editor, you see code like that. And then when a lot of information, a lot of operations, setters, getters, if statements on different levels on your application, maybe in the controller, maybe in the service. By the way, this is a part of the service class. It also means that you may apply some of them into this code. I mean, if you see that your application perform set of the setters here and here and here, so probably it means that those informations must change together, because if there will be no need to modify, they will be not modified. And if you see that those setters or sequence of the setters is followed by one or many different checks, where during this check you are verifying the state of the object you are trying to modify, probably you may expect there is something which probably should focus your attention. Because if you are looking on the object, you are extracting data from the object, you are reviewing some data outside an object, and then you are changing the state of the object based on the results you calculated before, it probably means that you are violating some paradigms. And maybe, just maybe, you've got an aggregate in your code, but it's already hidden. And maybe during the even very, very simple refactoring techniques like extract method or remove method, you may introduce this kind of concept to your code, even without having a very, very large domain knowledge. And of course, having a big knowledge about your domain allows you to make a lot of good decisions, but sometimes even if you are just reading the code, you might introduce some changes. So finally, what is an aggregate? So I think this is a unit of consistency, right? Because we discover, or we can discover, that in this part, our system must be consistent during the change introduction to the system. And this one of possible implementation that for this consistency boundary, that it means that inside this consistency boundary, there is a cluster of objects which must be changed together. And of course, this cluster expose one of this object, one of the entity to the world, which allows us to modify the state of the internal cluster of the objects. And of course, you shouldn't modify this state without touching this object. I mean, sending query directly to the database, because this object may contain some logic, some if statements, which must guarantee those consistency rules. And if you are messing your data directly from the depository queries or database queries, you are probably doing something wrong. If you are designing this cluster of object and you would like to embed another aggregate to your aggregate, it's probably not the best idea, because this aggregate which you are trying to embed inside the other aggregate probably has a different life cycle, probably is designed to maintain a different scenario. And it means usually that your boundary of your aggregates is not the best and must be redesigned just to maintain both scenarios. So this aggregate can be treated as a guard of business invariants. So we need to discover them by, for example, using the EventStorming or other technique where we would like to have a knowledge what kind of environment, what kind of scenario we need to protect. And then we can start to think what kind of data we need to have in our aggregate to maintain this invariance. So also the aggregate will be a guard of concurrent changes, because the aggregate will guarantee a consistency during the change. So if there will be another concurrent modification, which will probably must be postponed, for example, using some technique like optimistic locking or other technique of locking, because of these concurrent modifications. And of course, sometimes if you are talking about the performance, the things of this, the size of this thing we are designing may matter. The smaller aggregates will allow us to achieve a way better performance because of smaller number of data fetched from the database, smaller time of the object creation in the memory. So overall, in this scenario, the small is better. And after all, one more time, I need to agree with the Alberto that aggregate is the thing you shouldn't ask with the business. This information is taken from this Kandinsky session. I can only agree with that because the first rule of business conversation, if you are talking with the business people about the business problem, is you do not talk about the aggregates. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Mariusz. Super. Well, you said it was not going to be an in-depth presentation, but I think we covered a lot of ground indeed. And really happy also about the loads of questions we had in the chat during your presentation. So I would start straight away. I would give us another max 20 minutes if you agree. So we go with some questions so also folks know what to expect and how long we're staying here for. I'll start from the very first one. It popped up just before you started talking about commands. So almost, well, I wouldn't say an hour ago, but almost. So Michal, hi, thank you very much. If you answered these questions already during the presentation, we can skip them and carry on. Otherwise,
in this example and this code, which is on my GitHub with the repository aggregate by example, the final score is calculated based on the policy, and sometimes you need to have all the information about the documents, and sometimes you need to have some of them, let's say 80%. So usually in most scenario, you need to have all the documents reviewed. So this is a minimal information to start calculate the final score.
Thanks, Mariusz. Michal, let us know if you need any further clarification. Let's move on to the next question from Michal. Thanks, Michal. So can one aggregate be mapped to multiple entities in database? Can one aggregate be filled with data from various tables?
Yeah, of course. There is no need for mapping one aggregate to one table. The aggregate is a consistency boundary. Your aggregate can be mapped for the multiple tables, and then just touch this data using the aggregates. Never touch those data directly from the database. So usually when we are designing the aggregates, of course, we are trying to design the smaller aggregates as possible to achieve the high performance of the system. So usually it will be mapped to one database table, but if you've got some relations, it's not an issue, can be taken from the different database. Because of the locking mechanism, it will be not able, another processes will not be able to mess your data.
Fantastic, thanks a lot. Trying to
I think in the legacy fighter repository on the GitHub, there is an example where one aggregate is mapped into the multiple tables, I believe. So there is no need to one-to-one mapping.
Cool. Would you like to share the link to it? So I put it in the chat if it's not private, of course.
No, it's public, but this repository is huge, so I will need to find this.
No worries.
I will try to put on my Twitter.
Okay. So please follow Mariusz if you are not already, but I'm sure you are. I'm trying to find the next question, which was from Pavel. You could explain the difference between aggregate and aggregate root. Not sure if you've mentioned this already, but hey.
Yeah, the aggregate root is this entity which is exposed to the world. So this entity you are interacting with, and the aggregate inside may have a cluster of other objects, but you interact with this external entity. I mean this entity which is root, which is exposed to the world. So this is different. This is a root of this graph of the object, and you are always communicating by the root, never without the root. And sometimes, of course, this entity which is external contains very, very little information. So there is no need to have very, very complex graph of objects inside the aggregate.
Cool. Right. So we have what appears to be the last one, but please, I mean, we are here for another few minutes. If nothing happens, of course, we'll close it. From Gildas or Gildas. Any advice for first-time remote EventStorming facilitator? Wow.
Remote. read the Alberto article about the event storming in remote. This is my proposition. But to be honest, if this is your first time in remote, and if you've got your team which can do with you, like, very, very small short session just to see what will happen. I mean, this is not production session. You can perform it because you may identify a lot of bottlenecks, a lot of different problems which are not visible, in the on-site event storming, but they are heavily important and during the remote. What I mean, for example, a good microphone, a possibility to switch the group. To switch the people between groups and things like that. If you can perform a training session, training, just a sample, even 15 minutes, let's do it. So try check of the production workshop, just to discover the problem which may hit you on the production.
So as Mariusz mentioned, I linked the article by Alberto.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Let's move on. So we have Michal again. Thanks for this. It's possible, probably no, to have multiple route in one
bounded context. Multiple. You are talking multiple aggregates in one bounded context, or one aggregate with multiple aggregate roots? Because multiple aggregates in single bounded context, yeah, it's a very common situation. But one aggregate with multiple roots, it sounds weird. To be honest, it's weird. But I don't see any reasons why we shouldn't have a multiple aggregates inside a single bounded context.
Cool. Let's move on. Yeah, I said, I need multiple to have event triggers. I think it's still Michal. Wow. I see the folks warming up in the chat. So after the presentation is over, questions are arriving, which is
I've got time. So if you've got some time, we can.
Absolutely. We are here for this and super curious. So Andrea, thanks for this. So when do you need to also define aggregates instead of just using an aggregate root?
I'm not sure if I catch the question, but it's very, very combined. If you design an aggregate, you've usually exposing this aggregate root to the word, so it's one to one. So I think having this aggregate root is just an aggregate if there are no information inside.
Okay. Adam, so aggregate, what is worse?
Yeah, okay, so if we've got a big aggregate, the big aggregate is not a problem itself, because if your system is not having a lot of users, not having a lot of traffic, so the big aggregate is not a problem. The big aggregate is a problem when there is a bigger number of requests to the application. Then we need to fight for the performance. But if this aggregate can maintain those business rules, it's okay. But when the aggregate is too small, too small for me means that I don't have enough data to maintain those business rules. So why do I have those aggregate at all? So in this scenario, I would like to say, in this scenario, too small is way worse, because the bigger allows me to fix my performance issue. But the smallest, I've got this initial problem which aggregates should solve. So let's say this way.
Okay. New one from Adam. Do you have any resources about using and writing policies?
The policy is a topic which is quite big, because the name policy is, the meaning of this word depends on the context you are talking about. I'm injecting the policies to aggregate just to tune this behavior and to allow modify this internal behaviors of the object by injecting the strategy patterns, and then it's just a strategy pattern. So what are the sources? I would like to refer to Eric Evans' book. I don't remember the chapter, but the Eric Evans, and of course von Vernon about the implementing.
The two Bibles, I would say.
Yeah.
DDD. Cool, thanks. New one. How should we store information about actions performed on aggregates, but not strictly correlated with aggregate states?
Action performs on aggregates, but not strictly correlated with aggregate state. I mean, in most scenario, if you are touching the aggregates is something which allows you to modify the system consistent way. So there is a modification. So if you are touching this aggregate for modification, the aggregate state will be changed, will be modified. Of course, you may perform some actions on the aggregate by reading the information from that. And if you would like to store some information, I will probably use a separated table just to keep the log. Okay, I use this information just for reading. For example, in bank industry or insurance companies, sometimes there are some, or governments domains, there is a requirement to log everything. And the aggregate will be probably not the best way to store this information. So probably it will be a dedicated store, but inside the same table, because probably I would like to have a transaction just to keep a consistency in the system, probably this way. But if I'm touching the aggregate to modify it, there's always a state change, unless I violated a rule, and then this aggregate state is not modified. Maybe I would like to store it. So very, very similar scenario.
Okay. Next, Sebastian. I haven't seen an aggregate with an entity root with the different name of the aggregate. Have you seen this?
No, usually the same.
Okay. So new one from Michal. When we are designing a system with event sourcing architecture, what is the sane number of events that might create an aggregate? Do you have any number which we can consider that it's too much?
It's too much. I would like to refer to the Oscar Dudich blog, Event-Driven IO. There is a Bible for the event sourcing. And then there is a lot of information there. Recently, but you are from Poland, so in my podcast there was an episode with the Oscar about this, about the temporal modeling, and what is the number. I think it's impossible to put the information. Okay, so 1,000 number events, it's okay, but 2,000 is not enough. I mean too big. It depends on your scenario. I remember that one library years ago has a limit of 500 events in one scenario, because they said if you've got 500 events, you probably design your aggregates a little bit badly. So it's very hard to answer, Michał, for this question, because there is no possibility to put some specific number.
Makes sense.
Because for example, if this event sourced object contains, let's say, 500 events, but you are touching this object 2 times per day, so even if this load operation will take 1 second, come on, it's not an issue. But if this object will be used 100 times per second, it's a completely different story. So frequency of the change, as I mentioned, with third approach, with temporal modeling, it's something you can perform. I remember one scenario from the production project where we had an object which may contains 10 events or 1 million, and this is a real scenario, and we decide, okay, let's split this lifecycle object. I mean, this lifecycle of this object into the, I think, 250. But it was calculated based on the performance of the infrastructure, and we decide, okay, 250 events, and this is a scenario when this frequency is very, very huge. So let's close this object. Let's create another object. So there is a transformation, one object into the another, and we maintain the integrity during this modification.
Okay, sorry for jumping into this. Marco asked me for a link about event sourcing, which I have not mentioned. Probably Marius has.
Yeah.
Thanks, Marco. And in the meantime, we'll carry on with the Q&A with the rest of the folks.
Yeah, I will put it on the comments.
Fantastic.
Maybe on the private chat here, if you would like to put it public, because I don't see a place. Yeah.
No worries.
The
Cool.
event driven.
Thanks. Let's carry on. Right. So from Andrea, based on the answer, big aggregate is not a problem unless there is a performance issue. Could we conclude that the decision of splitting an aggregate route into a route and multiple aggregates is perfect? I guess is perfect because at one point YouTube cut your comments.
No. I would like to say something different. I'm not splitting the aggregate root into the root and the aggregate. I'm trying to extract some information from this cluster of objects which create an aggregate with the root outside. So this is not root and the rest. I'm cutting the root. No, I'm taking particular information outside because the reason for that is that they are not needed to maintain this business rules, which are invariants. So we are trying to reduce the number of the information which must be maintained. It is inside this consistency boundary. But this is I verified with this idea with different teams, and if we are starting to ask ourselves what is the reason, and you need to put it on the paper, on the mirror. You see the number of the information you would like to put there, and you had to answer what is the reason for this particular information, how you would like to use it. Is it identification tracking? Is the change capturing? Is the protecting invariance or the presentation? The results are sometimes very, very surprising, because in most scenario, we would like to attach a lot of presentation information into the aggregate, and this is not needed. And this is a way, one of the possible way how you can reduce the size of this object and how you can gain performance.
Okay, so 4 to go. After that, we'll call it a day for today. Thank you very much, Mariusz, for the patience and for sticking around.
It's a pleasure.
So, what book could you recommend about making storming much more clear and making investigation of the main rules much more understandable for business?
Forget about the technology. For a moment, and especially, is it possible? Okay, sometimes it's not possible, but in most scenario, if you are not talking about high performance, ultra high performance, ultra worldwide systems, we can exclude the technology from the equation. And if we can do it, so all the events will represent the business. And it's very, very easy to understand. So that example, taken from the production session, the verification loan application status changed. This is a very, very technical event because in this way, we are exposing the information that we've got a status. But the reason for that, why the status is modified, is a little bit different. And if we start to modify those events just to understand the business, like loan application accepted, as a consequence, we've got this change status, but this status is just an implementation. It's very, very easy to grab everyone attention and bring everybody into the discussion. Forget about the implementation part for the moment. And I noticed that for most people, I mean, but most of the developers, let's say it this way, it's not an issue. It's 15 seconds to switch the mindset. And after all, on the process level, let's keep this exactly the same. Let's talk about the business if the technology is something we can extract from the equation. But when it comes to the conclusion, I'm in this convergent phase of the storming. Okay, let's bring the technology into the room. We've got all the knowledge from the business because we talk about the business using the business terminology and business word. So our knowledge should be really, really nice. And then let's combine this with the technology.
But I guess the question was about a book, if there's any about
Book.
yeah. I have an answer.
Yeah, introducing EventStorming by Alberto.
Yeah, that would be one.
I need to say that the practice is, sorry, Alberto, way better. You need to practice.
Cool. Let's move on. Maxio. Is policy the same as specification? If not, what's the difference?
No, the policy is not a specification. The specification is just a possible way how you can implement this policy. The policy may be just a strategy or decorator. In this example, I show with this example, aggregate by example repository on my GitHub. So this is used by the strategy and decorator pattern. The specification allows us to implement way more flexible solution, but also sometimes it's very, very hard to maintain the specification. It's just one of the way how you can tune your behavior of the aggregates without touching the whole concept. Just inject some rules.
Okay, so let's move on. We have the last few questions. Michal again. Thank you very much. About events and aggregate routes. Should be Yagni, sorry for saying this wrong for sure, and deal it with changes in feature, or maybe make event per every change in aggregate?
Your aggregate may be event driven. Your aggregate maybe not event driven. I would like to let's focus what we know right now. If there will be a change in the future, we can always refactor our solution. And sometimes we can prepare for the changes, sometimes not. It's impossible to prepare for every single change which can be introduced. So sometimes do what you can at this point to gather most knowledge as possible and try to use it as implement. And when there will be a change in the future, we can refactor.
Thanks. Got another one. Have you ever seen an aggregate that has idempotency rules coded inside? Is that something wrong?
I think I never saw it on the value object. Yeah, of course, but I think no.
Okay. So we had the last one from Jakub. Actually, we have one before, which is connected to the one we were reading about. Let me see if I find it. No, it looks like it was completing something else. I think it was on the one when we were talking about big aggregate is not a problem unless. Anything to comment on this?
When aggregate root is not the entity itself but contains entity, the root will be entity and may contains other entities because there are some connections between them, but this external root will be an entity. Okay. From the concept of the design of the system, from the terms of the tables, it's completely different story. The mapping, how this object will be mapped to the database, it's something which can be a little bit different.
Cool. Very last one. Thank you all for being with us. Really appreciate.
By the way, I think I messed up with the one of the previous questions with the impotence. I answer on the Twitter, but I need to take a moment for that.
Okay, so please follow Mariusz if you are not already, and of course reach out to him if you need. Jakub asks, how to handle the case when an aggregate rules may change because of selected pricing plan in different bounded contexts?
Oh, if the change of my object relies on the data I fetch from another part of the system, another bounded context, which may be another microservice, for example, it means that I agree that I'm using a still data. And if I need to guarantee my changes, I need to know that I've got this stale data. And sometimes it's not a problem, to be honest. And Kuba, you are probably from Poland based on the name. In the legacy fighter repository, there is an example for that. However, I would like to avoid this situation probably, or at least ask the question to the business if this particular scenario we can use those data which are external from our part of the system and may be a little bit obsolete. So generally speaking, it's not a problem until everyone knows and agree. And how to handle? Just read the information from the other parts of the system or react to the event.
Cool. Righto. Thanks, Mariusz. It's been a pleasure to have you with us, and hopefully this will be the first of other events or occasions where we can talk to you and to our beautiful learners online. Thanks for all the questions. Anything you'd like to say as a closing?
I would like to thank all of you, Enrico, to you for the invitation, and all of you for having a great time with us. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Amazing. Thanks a lot. If you want to know more about new videos on EventStorming, software development, etc., subscribe to our channel here. Just a click away, and we will see you very soon. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye-bye.